because there's a echo.
Oh, you are still experiencing an echo, even with your headphones plugged in?
Only because I'm hearing myself on Clubhouse. There's a echo.
You're right. Oh, you are still experiencing an echo. Okay, try one more time. Go ahead and tell us a little about yourself.
Well, here we are. This is my first time doing Clubhouse and Zoom together.
Yeah, okay. I guess we do have an echo. All right. So we're gonna go to plan B. Unfortunately, we're gonna take you off the Zoom, Catherine, so that you still remain in the app for Clubhouse. But for those people who are watching on the YouTube live stream, and actually I can take this off now. For those people who are still watching on the YouTube live stream, you should still be able to hear Catherine on the account. Get the mic a little bit closer. And she should be able to, if you have anything that you want to put in for the chat, Siobhan will be keeping an eye on it, and we'll be able to relay those questions back to her in the Clubhouse as well. So first things first, let's actually get started on just talking a little bit about what this is. Catherine, let me do just a little bit of a setup on my end while there's still potentially people coming in. I myself, until you reached out to me, in 2017, I want to say, was that when we first met?
Mm-hmm. I think it was.
And you were,
yeah.
You were doing a conference, and it was an online conference. It was actually, I think, the first online conference that I was privileged to be invited to. And I hadn't actually heard of lipedema. And I was like, why haven't I heard of lipedema? It sounds like it has to do with lipids and has to do with, fat storage and so on and so forth. And it really became a rabbit hole, because I remember the weekend that I learned about it, and I started researching into it. I was like, wait a sec, why haven't I heard about this? This is not only very prominent, but it's actually something that really relates back to this research with how fat storage can work and not work if there's a dysregulation. And I think we may still have that recording somewhere. I think I basically say the same thing in our interview, that I was amazed. I was amazed at how little I knew for how prominent it actually is out there. And that's why I'm very thankful for that introduction. It really was very impactful for me.
It was, well, it's interesting, because the thing that's interesting is that it was first named in 1940, and it's been a long time, and there was no research, there was nothing done on it. It was literally buried. Two docs at the Mayo Clinic had recognized and written about lipedema, and pretty much until a small group of us who were global started to poke around and started to connect with different doctors and started to connect with one another and forming a global community, that some change has come. It's been slow, it's been hard won, but now it's recognizable, and that is amazing. Now that's recognizable within small pockets of community across the world. But again, I got a phone call from someone in New York struggling, trying to find a doctor where she could get diagnosis and treatment. And, I often have to say, the pathway for lipedema, number one, is education, so that you know what you're dealing with. Number two, knowing, and this I got from you, Dave, this is the thing that we asked you about, is N equals 1. You are your own laboratory. you have to learn how your body responds. And we have lots of suggestions. We have lots that we know works for lipedema, but you have to find the combination that works for you, because it's such a bio-individual that you have to take what we know and almost like put the pieces together on your own body to begin to experience the kind of freedom that so many of the women have begun to experience. Now, lipedema at this point does not go away. There is not a cure, but what there is that works for you, because it's such a bio-individual. Sorry.
No worries.
We're getting feedback. What women are beginning to discover, number one, that a diagnosis that they've had for many, many years of just obesity is not accurate, that there is a pathophysiology going on. What that pathophysiology is in the process of being identified in a much more comprehensive way. But again, as I've said, it's been quite a journey. And Dave, you were the one who started the whole, I think, movement around bio-individuality and biohacking.
That's very gracious. I will say that I think I'm standing on the shoulders of many other giants, people I've been inspired by. I will say that without question, this is one of those scenarios where I really have to draw attention to something I can relate to, which is that when I first saw my cholesterol rise from going on a ketogenic diet, everything that I was reading in the literature said it's absolutely familial hypercholesterolemia. You simply cannot have, total and LDL cholesterol that high unless there's a genetic component to it. And this sort of led me down the path of really kind of examining how it is that we can get these misdiagnoses in general, which kind of rounds it back to this, which is that it's almost what you could say is worse than a lack of diagnosis is a misdiagnosis. And to your point, that's my concern, is that if there's not, I think the first part of this is in getting better at recognizing what it is. The second part of this is for those who are dealing with this to become themselves reporters of the data that they observe, to elevate that up, the crowdsourced data. And I think that's kind of my larger message, is it isn't just being bio-individual and, sort of finding out how you can hack and find out information, but also how you can share it and share it effectively. Because let's face it, in many respects, and lipedema is, I think, another example, unfortunately, in many respects, you can't just count on the powers that be to work as hard as you would working with the illness that you're seeing in front of you that doesn't have a lot of information around it yet.
It's one of the things that we've covered in different webinars and different classes that we offer, because if you don't, you're often left without the kind of support that you need in order to deal with what is a very serious disorder that has very real impact. There's pain, there's swelling, there's bruising, there's a whole process of progression that goes on. So it's not just that you have some extra weight in different parts of your body. There's an actual dysfunction that goes on in the system itself. And that's something that is so important for people to realize and to begin to do something about themselves. And it can be done. I mean, it has been done. and people are doing it. And there's a couple things. One is that it's fat. And, you know, it is I think, the bias that everyone colludes on. There's a collusion culturally. You know, fat is not okay. It's like, you know, we do everything we possibly can to eliminate fat. And as, you know, I want to say as women, especially since lipedema is a disorder that affects women primarily, it makes it even more complicated. There was a study at Harvard that looked at bias, explicit and implicit bias. And it showed that those in healthcare, some of which were actually treating obesity, had the highest degree of implicit bias. So that when someone walks in, there's almost an automatic, to say judgment, it's more than that, it's a belief structure that, oh, this person is making lifestyle choices that are not supportive of them having a healthy body and a healthy system. And it's so tied into the calories in, calories out model, which we all know just doesn't work. We know that doesn't work. And your buddy, Ivor Cummings, gave us some really good advice very early on, because we had a lot of anecdotal information. And he said to us, when you have a database of anecdotal information, it has some impact. So we used our anecdotal information, and now we have much more scientifically based and we're growing in that area. But it is quite the journey.
Yes, I'm sure. You know, before we get too much further, let's go ahead and unpack real quick what lipedema is, and for that matter, what it regularly gets misdiagnosed as.
So lipedema is a fat disorder, but it's also a lymphatic disorder. So the lymph system is not well known, even in our healthcare system. Dr. Roxon from Stanford did a study and found out that in most medical schools, the lymphatic system is mentioned a total of half a day out of a whole 4 years in medical school. Mm-hmm. So interesting. And so the lymphatic system is part of our immune system. And so it's what helps us to stay well. And when the lymphatic system isn't working well, you're going to experience more and more almost sludge in your system. So with lipedema, you're looking at a fat disorder that affects the metabolic system. You're looking at a lymphatic disorder that affects the lymph system, and it causes quite a bit of havoc. The issue is it's a very slow growing disorder. It generally is triggered by hormones. So most women will report having changes that are visible. And when I say visible, oftentimes there's a fairly normal torso, but the legs, the butt, the hips, up can be the calves, can also include the upper arms, start to have abnormal fat distribution. So you get someone with a size, small top and a large or extra large bottom. And when you start to realize that that's something that has a name called lipedema, you can begin to recognize it walking through the grocery store, walking in the mall. You see this kind of shape, which is different than what is gynoid obesity. Gynoid obesity is obesity that's lower body. but this has a very particular feel to it. And it's nodular. When you palpate, you can actually feel nodules of hard fat under the subcutaneous level. And it's painful. Now, what causes the pain? That's one of the things that we've spent time looking at. Well, there's all the interactions of these systems coming together. I often think of it as a ball of yarn that has different colors. If you think of the venous system, and you think of the lymphatic capillaries, and you think of the adiposity, the adipose tissue, and all together under the skin, there's an intertwining that starts to happen. And that fat, that excessive fat that is part of the lipedema fat, actually can press against the capillaries. And as it presses against the capillaries, you can get lymphatic disorders with obesity, but the lymphatic disorders with lipedema come with stages of lymphedema. And so it becomes it's complicated. And we've been spending, a few years at most, since we started in maybe 8 or 9 years ago, trying to understand it.
I want to take a moment to also introduce my colleague, Siobhan Huggins. I think she has like some questions and some comments that she'd want to add. And Siobhan, I think you may have a little bit to share with your own story as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I actually ended up coming about this from kind of a weird way, because from what I understand, a lot of the time what happens with lipedema is they find out that they have lipedema, and then they go on a ketogenic diet because they've heard that it can help with the symptoms. And what actually ended up happening with me is I had typical obesity, so abdominal obesity, obesity everywhere. To give a frame of reference, I've lost about 10 inches off of my waist after going on a ketogenic diet. So there was a lot of abdominal obesity there. And so looking at me at the time, you wouldn't have looked at me and been like, oh, you have lipedema, because it's possible there was lipedema fat there, but it was hidden under all the rest of it. And I'm wondering how often that actually happens, and people would just never know, because it's like, oh, well, you have obesity and that's it. So that's been kind of an interesting experience for me. And I do have a tentative lipedema diagnosis at the moment, and I'm getting a follow-up next month to confirm it. And I wanted to bring up a question from the chat, which is quite easy to answer. Actually, Darlene said she is checking in from El Paso, Texas, and she has been diagnosed with lipedema, both legs and arms. And she asked.
Oh, you froze up for us for a second. Siobhan, can you repeat that real quick? You froze up for us on our side.
Okay.
No.
Hopefully this settles out. Darlene was asking who we're speaking to, and that is Catherine Seo. And Catherine, do you have any preferred methods where people can look you up and get more information on what you're working on?
Yeah, people can go to the website lipedemaproject.org or lipedema-simplified.org. And
so let me then see if I can kind of top view this real quick. So what you're both describing is, here's the scenario. The scenario is somebody, and let's actually kind of put something else on the table real quick. This does seem to disproportionately affect females. I don't know what the ratio is. Catherine, you might know what's the ratio typically?
Oh, it's almost close to 99%. It is a hormonal disorder. There are some men, and I know this to be true, who have hormonal imbalances that are estrogen dominant. And they can develop lipedema, but it's rare.
So that's obviously a very important clue. But to get to the point that you were making, Siobhan, that you're wondering, and I'm wondering this as well, if there aren't a number of people who are diagnosed as obese who do have a lot of subcutaneous fat that's all around their body, for which lipedema could be kind of considered a little less obvious to, say, a treating physician because it looks just like general, say, morbid obesity. But for which, when that person seems to be on a pathway towards losing a lot of weight, they find that they're losing it disproportionately. And this is something you experience where, for example, a very common one is it's lost in the waist. And so actually the waist gets like really small, yet there's a lot of retention, very stubborn retention. Like it's not even just even a little bit. Like let's say, you lose 30% in the waist and it's just 15% in the legs or something like that. No, like the legs just hardly budge at all. Where it seems like it's not just stubborn, like it's just not going anywhere, period. That's a common out. That's something to watch for if you're in the process of losing weight and you're not seeing it. Granted, again, we're not doctors. We're not saying this is self-diagnosable in that regard, but that is definitely a big clue that I think everybody should be watching out for, right?
Yeah, it certainly seems that way. And I've actually had recent experience with that where even just in general going on a ketogenic diet, like I lost the fat off of my waist fairly easily. I mean, over the course of a couple years, my legs did decrease in size and they seem to be less affected than my upper arms are. But like even now, my upper arms are disproportionate and like noticeably so, where I've gotten comments on it from people, and that is kind of relating to the judgmental type of thing that can come up, especially because I like do presentations, so people see me in videos and then it's like, oh, but like why like why aren't you super thin? It's like I wish I knew the answer to that. And I guess now I have a bit of a better idea, but it's very interesting. And I had done that fasting experiment at the tail end of last year, and I was keeping track of measurements. And it was like a 2-week fast and then 1 week of only having fat, so no protein, no carbs. And I ended up losing a fair amount of weight over it. I lost several inches off my waist. I actually did lose several inches off of my thigh as well. But like I said, they're less affected. But my arms went down by a whole like quarter of an inch. It was like, are you kidding me?
Wow.
Yeah. I've been looking over the data again recently and it's like, wow, yeah, that really just did not budge at all.
I feel this. I think this is part of why this kind of tugs at my heartstrings to some degree. I feel really bad for anybody who's on a health journey, who particularly is feeling good about the weight loss that they're having, would find that something like this was occurring and then not have an immediate answer as to what's happening. This underdiagnosing is something that really does concern me a lot. And it's unfortunate because I do feel, I don't know, I don't want to sound cynical, but sometimes I feel as if there's some kind of procedure or medical intervention that's more of a silver bullet, then it is more likely that something will get attention. And I worry that that's kind of the case with lipedema, is that because there's not clearly a means of treatment yet, it doesn't quite get the same level of focus on research as I would hope that it would.
There is a recent breakthrough. Dr. Stanley Roxon is really one of the experts in the world on the lymphatic system. And his research identified a marker for lipedema, platelet factor 4. So knowing that and having that identified opens the door to the possibility of a blood test that could actually identify the presence of that marker. Now, the thing about it is he did it with his colleagues as a research project, and the bridge to commercialization, where a test could actually be done to get that information. The last I heard, I talked to him some months ago, he's working on that process, but that's not a simple process because commercialization of that kind of a test takes quite a bit of funding in order to make that happen. So anyway, I have hope that Dr. Roxon's going to come up with a way to do that because he's pretty amazing.
You know, I know a blood testing service that's run by some people who are very obsessed with, you know, trying to get some of these harder to diagnose diseases found. Anyway, I'm obviously joking a little bit about us, but naturally that was the first thing I thought of was there's a test that's out of Finland that I really want to get called Nightingale, which they're trying to get FDA funding for. And they were saying effectively the same thing to us. Is they said, it's probably a little too esoteric for most people, to which I want to be able to say,
never underestimate like geeks.
Yeah, exactly. We may be a good, you know, portal for geeks. I think on top of that, we would be a good portal for people who are looking into the ketogenic diet. I think therefore there'd be more people who would become aware of things like lipedema for these kinds of purposes. So yeah, I'm all for trying to get it as commercialized as possible, as soon as possible.
As soon as it's available, I want it through oil, and I'll just be getting it all the time. Because one thing I'm curious about with stuff like blood markers is, let's say that you have someone with lipedema and then you put them on a ketogenic diet. Is that blood marker still going to be the same as it was before, or is it going to be impacted by the ketogenic diet? Where it's like, oh, if you're on a ketogenic diet, this doesn't actually work as a marker for lipedema anymore. Like,
Right.
That's something I would want to know, like, get baselines beforehand, including that test, put them on a ketogenic diet, follow up in like 4 months, and then see what changes and what doesn't. That's something I'm super fascinated by, and it's like, why doesn't this already exist?
Yeah, let me back up a little bit because I think there's some history here that might be relevant to our conversation. In that lipedema has been held as resistant to diet and exercise. That's the terminology that's been used. It's in the literature, the very little bit of research that's been done, and a lot of anecdotal information from patients all around the world, you know, who have tried all sorts of rigorous dieting and exercise programs in order to affect it and have not seen any impact. And then in 2015, the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland, had the very first ever symposium, an international symposium on the lymphatic system. Dr. Roxon was part of making that happen. Bill Rapisi, who runs the Lymphatic Education Education Network, that's what it is, LEARN, it's called, in New York. He was part of it. Kathy Bates was there. She has lymphedema, and she was one of the speakers. Yeah. And it was a really powerful bringing together of many of the researchers, advocates, and I happened to be there with Dr. Smith, who was then funding and helping get the word out about lipedema. And I met a researcher there who is also an occupational therapist and has worked in the lymphedema world for like 20, 25 years, Leslyn Keith. She was presenting a poster there, and you both know Leslyn. And her research was a small study that she had done for patients who had lymphedema, looking at a ketogenic diet as a way to intervene. And she got very significant results enough that when she and I started to talk about it, it's almost as if like you two have this. One of you will start a sentence and the other one will finish. And so with Leslyn and I, it was like we both looked at each other and said, I wonder if a ketogenic diet would work with lipedema. And that was the question in September 2015. In August, and she was finishing her research, and I was in the process of actually writing a book. I went to Europe. I spent about 6 months in Europe working with a number of the docs there. And when I came back from Europe, I had a webinar, and it was interesting. Some of the folks from Europe were supposed to do the webinar, and it didn't pan out because of time zones and different commitments. And I ended up inviting Leslyn and a couple of women that I had heard about who had done a ketogenic diet and had impact with lipedema. So we ran a webinar in the middle of that summer, and we had a really good attendance. And we started to get reports in from women who were losing weight for the first time ever.
Wow.
After they'd done everything else on keto. And so we said, this is fairly interesting. Again, the whole model, Dave, is your N equals 1. We tell them from the very beginning, we say N equals 1. You got to figure it out here. We can tell you this. But what works for you is what you're going to, you'll have to meander till you find exactly the right thing for you. But there's some things that we could say, 20 grams of carbs or less. And some of the women can't even do 20 grams of carbs. At the fundamental part, lipedema is an inflammatory disorder. And that inflammation starts to resolve itself almost within days. We've had one woman, she went on keto with us, and within a week, she's told us she had been in pain every day of her life that she could remember. She would get up in the morning, and she would just be in excruciating pain. She was getting to the point that the pain meds were no longer working for her. And after being on keto for a week, she's actually going to be presenting at our next symposium, which is April. After a week, she went to get out of bed, and she like, something is wrong. Something is really wrong. So she got back in bed and got out of bed again. And she said, I'm not in pain anymore. And
wow.
She's lost, she had a journey. She's been on keto for now, I think probably a year and a half, but changes. Another woman came, and I know May 2019, because we have a series, we have a very intensive small group where we work with those who are wanting to do the intensive work. And anyway, she had a heart attack 10 years prior. At the time that she came, she was 321 pounds. She had done everything. She had been being wrapped. She had been getting manual lymph drainage. She wore compression garments. She had been on various diets with the nutrition, and nothing had worked for her. It wasn't an overnight success, but it is now it'll be 2 years in May. She's lost 148 pounds on keto. Wow. And has totally transformed. She was immobile. She was mostly in a wheelchair. She started, it's just amazing to witness this. But she started by walking down her driveway to the mailbox. That was the most that she could do. And then she walked in her neighborhood, and now she goes to the gym and works out with the trainer. So we have seen the kind of miracles. That's why Leslyn and I got so excited, because we started to get all this reports about what was happening and how people were experiencing it. And then we started to do even more research. So we recently published a paper looking at the ketogenic way of eating as an intervention for lipedema. And we're able to go through some of the metabolic issues and the inflammation and how the inflammation worked and how keto addresses that. So I think it was pretty much a miracle.
I've said this, I think I said this to Siobhan a couple months ago. In my opinion, I try to be as diet agnostic as I can. I know people for which different diets worked better for them. I know people who tried keto first and they needed to ultimately come to something that wasn't keto. I know some people aren't plant-based and they're thriving on plant-based. They seem to be doing well. I tend to try not to start with the presumption that keto or even low carb is the predominant and clear superior choice, except in what I consider to be a few cases for which it seems the most obvious first choice to shoot for, which to me, the case seems to be the strongest for epilepsy and for type 1 diabetes. For those, if it was my family member, I would want them to start there. Like diet-wise, I'd be like, no, actually, in this case, I would prioritize just straight up low carb ahead of that. And given what I've been learning, mostly through Siobhan and a lot of the research she's been doing, but also on what you're talking about now, I'm wondering if I'd add lipedema, because I just don't hear these kinds of success stories with lipedema and keto with any other diet. Granted, I don't talk to as many as you have, but it really does seem to be almost uniquely, specifically of value with lipedema in particular.
Oh yeah, I would absolutely say it. So a little bit, I always hesitate because sharing my own story is always a little dicey, but my own story is that I struggled with weight and obesity. And obviously now, as I look back, had lipedema since I was a very young teenager and didn't know it. But I meandered my way into a low carbohydrate food plan in my 30s. And I lost 140 pounds. I was morbidly obese and struggled. And, I did everything under the sun. And I loved when Siobhan said, you do all this stuff and, you end up still not skinny mini. I mean, so I got in a 12-step program, and the 12-step program that I was in for Overeaters Anonymous, I was on what was considered the lowest carbohydrate diet. As I look back on it, it was a blessing, because at the time when I started, which was in the mid-'80s, we didn't know what we now know about carbohydrates. I mean, I was like, I can remember thinking, if I don't eat carbs, my hair's going to fall out, my nails are going to get weird. It was like this incredible thing, except that it worked. I mean, within a year, I had lost 100 pounds and nothing was moving anything. And but it was predominantly, as I look back on it, what I do today is very different, because it was predominantly plant-based. It was, there was very little fat. It was predominantly plant-based with protein. It was very, I weighed and measured every single morsel. I did that no matter where I was, and it worked. And I maintained it, which is the hardest part around any kind of weight loss, is maintaining. But I maintained it for over 20 years until the fateful day that we all must face as women, when perimenopause starts. And during that period, I started to gain weight without any explanation. It's like I would go to my primary care, who's wonderful, absolutely wonderful doc, and he couldn't figure it out. I couldn't figure it out. He sent me from all kinds of tests. It took a few years. I ended up going on some hormones, and it kept it at bay for a little while. And then as I actually became postmenopausal, it got worse and worse. And I have heard this story. If I've heard it once, I've heard it hundreds of times from so many women, because the hormonal disturbance, the hormonal dysfunction plays havoc with lipedema, more so than almost anything else. And it led me in the direction that I am now sitting here talking to you, because it was like I had no choice. It was like, I'm a firm believer. I love when Siobhan calls you guys geeks. Well, I am a geek. I believe firmly that there are answers, that for every problem, there is an answer. It may not be the answer you want. It may not be the answer you like, but there is a solution to everything. And when I started, nothing about lipedema. There was nothing.
Yeah.
It was this amazing journey. And, I found Dr. Foldy, Professor Michael and Atelka Foldy, the Foldy Clinic in Germany. They knew about lymphedema. They knew about lipedema. I went to Germany, actually spent quite a bit of time there. And again, there had to be an answer. And I'm happy to say that we did find answers, and keto is one of the cornerstones. It works. Now, it doesn't work for 100% of the people 100% of the time, which is why we always say N equals 1. Right. I had been on a plant-based diet for so long, it was outside of my realm of belief that if I ate a salad, it was not going to be good for me. One of the things that I discovered in my journey, especially when I was on keto, as I, tried to do everything, is that I had to really limit all carbs, including vegetables. Vegetables that I had eaten for.
Catherine? I'm worried we might have lost Catherine.
I'm hoping she'll pop back in. But yeah, I can definitely understand that thought process of okay, there are answers for this, and
it looks like she may have just come back in. Catherine, are you there?
Oh, I'm sorry. I think I lost you for a minute.
Yeah, you cut out right around the time you were talking about you couldn't imagine eating a salad was a problem, but then you realized you really needed to cut out all carbs.
Yeah, I went carnivore. That's what we, Leslin and I hooked up with Amber over and a couple of others, Sean Baker, a couple of others too. They're Rob Sibes, and I remember getting off of one of the interviews and saying to Leslin, you know what? I think I'm going to try carnivore. And it worked. I'm very relaxed. So I do, I'll go back and forth. I do a lot of intermittent and alternate day fasting, and it keeps me healthy. I'm still not at the weight that I want to be at. I'm still not at the weight that I had gotten to before menopause and before lipedema, but it's tolerable, and I can see progress.
But health is a journey. It's there's no, I know of so few people who are like, oh, I got there. I got to where I'm healthy, staying here. I'm good. Where it's like, I got everything I wanted out of it. No, it's a process for sure. And I have to tell you, one of the toughest things for me to unlearn and not taking the pendulum to the other direction. But I really credit Amber O'Hearn for teaching me a lot of this, is that, everything's on the table. I've grown up sort of thinking of fruits and vegetables as almost a non-topic as being healthy. Of course, they're the obvious healthy choice, and you should always be sure that you have some of them in your diet. And this isn't to say that they're not. This isn't to say that they're, that you can't derive nutrients from them, etc. It's just, if I were to write a diet book, it would be only a few pages long, and it would say something like, don't consume the things you have problems with. Ta-da. Right? Like, it sounds overly simplistic, but in truth, I now know people, and this includes my dad, who is very pathologically insulin resistant. He seems to really have a problem with even the most moderate amount of greens if the carbs bring it up high enough. For example, he's struggling right now with, he occasionally can't help himself. He gets some strawberries, which strawberries aren't really crazy high carb per se, but he has a lot of them, and he's only ever thought of them as super healthy, as I did growing up. But for him, it eventually brings up his insulin levels. It brings that he gets fatter on strawberries. His glucose goes up, his triglycerides go up, and it's why I'm glad I have him on a glucometer. And it's just because of where he's at. It's an individual thing. It's frustrating for him when my sister could be sitting right next to him and could gobble down all those strawberries and take her glucose in the morning, and it'd be like 85. She's in a different place than he is. But the point is that we can't just look at, one category of food that we grew up believing was only possibly healthy, because that's part of what I think becomes the problem, and us being able to figure out the solution.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, part of the problem that we're dealing with now is, and we're in such a different context compared to like, but this, like, these indigenous people eat this type of thing, so it must be healthy because they're healthy. And it's like, well, we as a populace are largely no longer healthy, and that brings so many things with it to where we may react poorly to something that if we were already healthy, it wouldn't be an issue in the first place. So I've experienced that with stuff myself. Like, I was fine, and then I did something that messed me up, and then now it's not fine. And it sucks, but I mean, it's one of those things that you just have to learn and accept that, look, if you have good evidence that you're not reacting well to something, maybe you just like shouldn't be eating it. Like, some people can definitely do the whole moderation thing. I can't do that, because for a lot of the stuff that I have issues with, if I have even a little bit, either what'll happen is I'll have a little bit and then I'll start craving it, or I'll have a little bit and it'll throw off my mood, which is one of like the biggest reason I stay so strictly carnivore, is for my mood. And if that starts going into shambles, it's like, no, no, that's not allowed.
By the way, while we're on this, I've wondered just how much our existing modern diet may be relevant to this disease itself. For example, I'm wondering historically, if do we, and Catherine, maybe you can speak this more succinctly, how much has this changed over time, or do we even have any idea?
I think there's more awareness. I think the keto is a movement right now, and it's coming from grassroots where people are taking control of their own health. And I think if we look back, when I began in Overeaters Anonymous in the mid-'80s, I feel like I was being blessed, because there's so many foods that didn't exist back then, that are bad for us. Processed foods. Joan Ifland is a wonderful presenter, researcher, a teacher who talks about the addiction to processed foods. When you think of some, the book, Lustig's work on sugar, the other book on fat, salt, can't remember, sugar, fat, salt, or no, not fat, sugar, salt, something, where they talk about the inclusion. They take out the fat, so it's low fat, and it tastes horrible. So they add in the sugar, so it's palatable. Then they add in the salt so that it stays on the shelf longer. And you've got Franken foods. And I just think they're so bad for us. And I think so much of what we are experiencing in terms of lack of health, lack of vitality, you know, I mean, it's just so rampant. And the statistics are going like off the chart with the degree and numbers from the CDC. I mean, we're in the midst of a pandemic, I know, but it's one of the things people report about the pandemic, that they're home and they're talking about, you know, the levels of weight gain throughout the country and really throughout the world.
It is something, I think I was just talking about this with somebody recently. It is still kind of amazes me how much this happened in a generation. How in one generation we have gotten surprisingly used to thinking of middle age, older age, having a lot of these chronic diseases at a proportionality that just was not there before, like not at the same degree, and how it's gotten younger and younger and younger. Like before, type 2 diabetes was adult onset diabetes, which is, they had to change the name because there's now so many teenagers, and unfortunately,
there are 6 months old with type 2 diabetes now.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking, but at the same time, it does make me wonder about the very point you're bringing up, Catherine, which is it's hard to disentangle how much the food we've been growing up on, that we've been eating, causes lasting harm, that even when we correct for our diet in later life, even when we get greater exercise and so forth, that we can't fully reverse it, or I don't know, that you get into such a kind of biological debt that you couldn't if you tried. It's a question that we're all facing.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the impression that I'm getting from lipedema is like, yes, there's lots of quality of life improvements and pain and aches and bruising and swelling and all this type of stuff. But there's also that lipedemic fat that's remaining. And in some of the research that I've read, it's talking about how it's fibrotic tissue, meaning it's basically scarred tissue. And if you've ever dealt with scarring anywhere, it's incredibly difficult to get rid of. I mean, it's a stable Band-Aid that your body has made to stabilize the injury. So it's like, well, why would I want to get rid of it? It's not like, just deal with it, dude. And yeah, so it's tricky. It's tricky, but at the same time, I feel like somewhere there's probably an answer to that as well. We just haven't found it yet. And I'm the type of person where it's like, if I can feel like in the air that there's an answer somewhere, like I just can't get the bug out of my brain until I figure it out. And then I'll like be like, oh, that's what it is. And then I'll never think about it ever again.
Just think of this. In each one of our bodies, there are 30 billion fat cells. 30 billion fat cells. I mean, when I read that, I thought, that's like 30 billion. I'm trying to lose 40 pounds. How many billion of cells is that?
I did want to open up an invitation if anybody who's either in the Clubhouse room has any questions, or for those who are watching the stream right now on YouTube, feel free to chat in any questions before we wrap up. But I have to say, this has been such a delight, Catherine, and it's really, like I said, I kind of tried to fit as much as I could. I was originally going to have lipedema, what it is, how it works, why is it so underdiagnosed, and I had to keep playing around with it because it wouldn't let me fit in all the letters, but I knew for sure I wanted to at least put in why it's so underdiagnosed, because I really think that that's one of the biggest problems now, is to just at least bring up the awareness. And with our own research with lipids, we find that doctors, particularly general practitioners, I mean, they're busy people and it's understandable. They typically learn about new things in one of two general channels. Either they hear about it from their colleagues or through pharmaceutical reps. Not a diss on pharmaceutical reps, just that's a lot of times where they see the studies, or from patients. A lot of times patients are their other means of learning things, which may sound a bit ironic because I know a lot of patients will complain that they feel like the doctors are not listening to them. But in truth, when there's a lot of predominant information coming from multiple different patients, and especially if they get really good, they often are surprised at how much doctors will listen, particularly if they see a lot of these patterns more and more in their own practice. And so we, beyond just trying to reach out to physicians, I think everybody needs to consider themselves as potentially a pivotal patient for their doctor to help spread further awareness, help them better understand lipedema if it's not something they're already familiar with, and what to look for and how they might see it in other patients of their own. I think it's an important thing for us to all keep in mind.
Yeah. And Catherine, I'm wondering also, do you have any resources for patients to take to their doctors that's just like a 1 or 2 page thing that's like, here's the prevalence, here's what it is, here's what we know can help, just so that the doctors can then take that information and give it to further patients who possibly have lipedema and phrase it in that way where it's like, not just there's nothing you can do, but instead like there's not currently a cure, but people are actively working on understanding this. There's a lot of treatment options that we can look at. You do kind of have to explore things to figure out what works, but here's some suggestions of where to start. Because I think that might be really helpful for people, because sometimes when talking to your doctor, it can be really overwhelming, just trying to figure out how to phrase things in a way that they try and get what you're saying and why it's so important, not only to you, but also to their other patients.
Yes. So the short answer is we have an ebook that was written specifically for clinicians. It's called a Lipedema, the disease they call fat, an overview for clinicians. It's a short book. It's not a long book. And we are in the process of taking the essence of that and putting it into like a fact sheet. We have an infographic that's available online. That's a 1-pager, but it doesn't go into the kind of detail, as you, of course it wouldn't, that we have in the book. So we're in the process of redoing some of that because there's more and more interest. We also have on Facebook, we have our Facebook page. It's Lipedema, the disease they call fat is the name of the page. And on the page is the documentary. So when I was doing my searching and looking for answers, I brought my video camera with me and produced a documentary film called The Disease They Call Fat, Lipedema. So, and we put it up on Facebook about a year or so ago, and it's up to 1.3 million views. So
that's great.
It gives me hope that people are getting the word, that it's starting to get even more momentum now.
That's fantastic.
I've done my part. I sent my doctor your paper on ketogenic diets and lipedema, told him he has to read it, and I'm going to send him that ebook as well so he can be caught up, and hopefully he can start kind of knowing what to look for in his other patients in case they need help, and he just didn't know until now.
Yeah, I have to say, so I have had an incredible primary care physician. He is now working with us as a colleague, which is amazing. He retired about a year and whatever, before the pandemic, he retired. But he listened. I mean, his quality of listening and exploration and partnership was so important, because I would go in to see him through this whole process, not knowing what was going on. And instead of, not paying attention or dismissing it as, oh, she's lying, she's getting up in the middle of the night and eating a box of cookies, no, I'm not. He really began to work with me together as colleagues, looking for an answer. He's one of the authors on the paper. He's one of the authors on the book. He's been incredibly supportive. And what I learned is this: most doctors get 15 to 20 minutes with patients. And they have this phrase that they say, if it looks like a horse, it's a horse. Well, no, sometimes it's a zebra, which is a whole thing in medical school. I learned this somewhere along the line. Well, lipedema patients are zebras. They're not horses. And when you get looked at like that, so many of the doctors, they're doing the best they can with 15 minutes. Right. What can you do in 15 minutes? You can't. Now, Dr. Carmody, bless his heart, if a patient needed an hour, he would give a patient an hour. If a patient needed 2 hours, he would give the patient 2 hours.
That's a good doctor.
That's a really remarkable doctor.
Yeah.
And now, he's like, he's one of us. He's working with us. And he's also an obesity medicine diplomat. So he's been through the obesity boards, and he has so much to say about what we're doing. But I have compassion in a way that I never did before for those who are struggling to serve us, to help us. And rather than, well, let me say this in a different way. I think it is my responsibility, because it's my health, that I need to do whatever I can to know as much as I can in order to meet a healthcare professional in a way that I can partner to see what kind of help I need, which is very different from going in and saying, fix me.
Right.
Which is what so many of us, what's the magic bullet? Give me a pill, give me a surgery, give me this. And the real truth is, it's just not that simple. And not only for lipedema, but for so many disorders. Look at fibromyalgia. Look at what you went through with cholesterol, trying to find what the balance is and how it works. It is something that, what's the phrase you use about citizen? What's that phrase?
This is a number of phrases I would use, but the one that comes to mind in this case is, look, at the end of the day, no one will take ownership of your health like you will at the end of the day. So it exactly the point you're saying, Catherine, because I think this is so important and so valid, is I recognize that, especially in the low carb space, there are a lot of people who feel betrayed. They feel like they grew up hearing certain things from their doctor that they now feel very differently about, and they kind of take it as just sort of an affront to the entire, medical profession, and they trust in their doctors less, and so on and so forth. And I think that that's not the best takeaway. I think that you were drilling into exactly what the challenge is that there's never been a time in medicine where efficiency gains have become the law of the land, to a degree with which there's such a tight window of time for which doctors need to work with their patients, and so on and so forth, to which you really just can't put everything on the doctor who you're talking to, or for that matter, that, they're the ones who are in charge of the same guidelines that could have had these impacts on us long-term, right? So at the end of the day, one of the things that I'm so fascinated about with the low carb movement is it's truly a grassroots movement. It didn't There wasn't, these award-winning studies that came out that all of a sudden general practitioners were like, you know what? I changed my mind about saturated fat, and I'm going to put you and my other, 58 patients on this high saturated fat, low carb diet. No, it was a bunch of people who were trying to tackle it for themselves. And that's what I think kind of started this tension. But that said, there is another, I think, light at the end of the tunnel that I would hope more low carbers, particularly those people who might have something like lipedema, who are finding some success in doing this, would take heart in, which is that at the end of the day, these doctors, they chose the profession because they want to be healers. They do care. Maybe there's some bad apples out there, but by and large, I think the vast majority of doctors want to help you. And you have to recognize that while you may have an informed answer to questions that you feel they should care about, they just saw another 99 patients that did have something they heard on the internet that really is ridiculous, because there really is just a lot of bad information out there, right? So I caution as much as I can everybody to have patience and to recognize that part of a grassroots movement is to know that it's going to be, slow going, and that also you yourself may not have all the answers, to also listen to them as well. They may have some new insights to carry back to you, but to recognize, getting back to the original point, no one will take ownership of your health like you will. Don't put so much on your doctor to have that level of power, because it's not like to where they're basically a god, because it's both unfair to you and to them. So at the end of the day, you really want to be partners, as you described, Catherine. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, and like I don't think it can be emphasized enough that going by what I've heard from a lot of doctors themselves, they don't like the 10 to 15 minute thing either. They despise it because
Right.
they don't like not getting to see their patients for an adequate amount of time. They don't like not being able to help their patients. They don't like their advice not working. And like Dave said, they got into the job by and large because they wanted to help people. And I think all of these factors coalescing together is resulting in problems with doctors just burning out on their job, because it's like, look, I got into this job because I wanted to help people, but every time I see my patient, they're getting worse. But from what we've seen is if they find something that does work, whether it's keto or not, they jump into it because it's like, finally, I can do something. So if they have the information, I mean, from what I've seen, they can get just as excited as you are to have these new answers and be like, oh, I can not only help you, I can potentially help my other patients if they have good evidence that it might work. So with my previous doctor, I would take in like paper abstracts, like Verda's new publication about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and I'd highlight the parts in the abstract that are important and like, you need to know this information. Because he was married and he had 5 kids. He's going to do his office job, and then afterwards he has to do the paperwork, and like, what time does he have to do this stuff? But he has time to read an abstract with highlighted parts. Like, okay. So, and I think it is very much like a teamwork thing. Like, I don't view my current doctor or my previous doctor as some like all-knowing god. I see him as this guy who has a lot of clinical experience and schooling and an interest in the topic and a great amount of curiosity for health and helping people. And I'll bounce ideas off of him and he'll bounce ideas off of me, and then we'll come to some sort of agreement and we'll see if it works or not. And if it doesn't work, we'll try something else. Like, I much prefer it that way rather than other doctors I've had where it was very much, do what I tell you because I know it. And I don't think they enjoy being in that position either. It's a lot of pressure.
Let's go ahead, and we're going to wrap up here in a sec, but I did want to get to some of these chats. One person I see here, Sean Sullivan, said my fasting insulin level was still at 6.9 after 7 months or of less than 10 carbs a day. Siobhan, actually, I think you can speak to this because you've been carnivore. You yourself have been under carbs, but you've kind of had a journey as far as insulin goes yourself, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've been on a ketogenic diet for 4.5 years, and I've been on a carnivorous diet for like 3 years and change or something. and my fasting insulin is still in like the 6 to 8 range. And I'm not a doctor. I can't give medical advice, so I can only speak on what I've seen in myself and others. But like sometimes when I see that, it's like the person is still like coming back from something, and it can take a while of figuring out what the right thing is, and sometimes just time. I gave a presentation on this exact topic at Keto Fest, where I was talking about pathological insulin resistance and all the factors that can go into sustaining it, not just like how many carbs you're eating and that impacting your insulin. So that might be of interest to watch. And personally, I like to look at things like as a bigger picture aspect. So is there, what does the lipid profile look like? What do the inflammatory markers look like? How are you feeling? How are your energy levels? Is there any indication that there may be something that's still not quite resolved, or maybe needs a little bit of tweaking to address? And sometimes that is just time. Like I've seen people who are like, yeah, my insulin was at the same level, but they were like strict carnivore, really hitting everything, really dug in deep, and addressed a couple minor things, gave it some time, and it came down on its own. And if not, like I always like to just keep an eye on it, work with my doctor to be comfortable with what's happening and the direction I'm headed in.
Darlene Mobley, you actually had a lot of great chats in here, but it sounds as if you're very interested in this information as well. And Catherine, just so you know, she says, yes, Catherine, I'm pending to join right now. So that's great. It looks like there'll be somebody else knocking on your door here in a second. Kurt Bryant says, what is the difference between lean mass hyperresponder and FH? While this topic isn't mainly focused on that, the short answer to that is we sort of define lean mass hyperresponders as, in particular, those people who see a diet-induced increase in their cholesterol levels. And while it's not in the official classification for it, it's basically presumed to be somebody who doesn't have FH. Like in theory, you could be both. You could be both a lean mass hyperresponder and have FH. That's not really been identified as much. The thing is, we just don't have a lot of data on it, because generally people who are diagnosed early with FH just end up not going in the pathway towards like saturated fat or anything along those lines, because they've had engagement with their doctors early on, and that already was something that wouldn't happen. We've had, Siobhan, I want to say maybe 4 or 5 that have like confirmed high level FH, like we're talking one of the monogenetics or something like that, in like all the thousands. So
yeah, not very many.
And then just a great comment from Glenn Williams. I love your attitude. Not Dr. Feldman, just Mr. Feldman.
Isn't Mr. Feldman your dad? Is that like a typical line?
Yeah, I guess. And thanks, you're speaking to us from Thailand. So I just wanted to once again thank Catherine. Before we wrap up, Catherine, can you tell us all again how everyone can find you?
Lipedemaproject.org, lipedema-simplified.org are our websites, and you can always reach me directly at Catherine@lipedema-simplified.org. Feel free to reach out to me.
Thank you so much for joining us for this Clubhouse, and yeah, we'll probably do another one of these again soon. So
yeah, this is fun. Once I got the initial, how do I do 3 things at once? It's cool.
Well, I hope you guys all have a wonderful Tuesday, and we'll see you again next time.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Siobhan. Absolutely great to be here with you.